They called him the Cyclops, a mountain of a man who devoured 40 pounds of meat and drank an entire amphora of wine in a single day. His thumb was so thick, he wore his wife's bracelet as a ring. Standing over 8 feet tall, this was Maximinus Thrax, the giant who clawed his way from shepherd to the most powerful man in the world. Emperor of Rome. This isn't just a history lesson, it's the story of a real-life titan, a human bulldozer who smashed through every barrier in his path. But how did a barbarian peasant, a man who barely spoke Latin, seize the imperial throne? And why did his own soldiers, the men who once worshipped him, turn on him in the most brutal way imaginable? Buckle up, because we're diving into the insane, blood-soaked saga of Rome's first soldier emperor. Our story begins around the year 173 AD, in a forgotten corner of Thrace, a rugged region in modern-day Bulgaria. This wasn't Rome. This was the frontier, the wild edge of the empire. Here, a boy named Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus was born to a Gothic father and an Hellenic mother. He was, in the eyes of the Roman elite, a barbarian, a half-savage from the provinces. He grew up not in a villa studying philosophy, but in the fields, wrestling and herding sheep. He was massive, strong, and possessed a raw, untamed energy. He didn't know Latin well, and his accent was a constant source of mockery for the city snobs. But what he lacked in refinement, he more than made up for in sheer, terrifying physical power. He was a natural-born warrior, a genetic freak of nature waiting for his moment. And that moment arrived when Emperor Septimius Severus came to town. It was the year 202. The emperor was hosting military games to celebrate his son's birthday. Young Maximinus, seeing his chance, boldly approached the emperor and asked, in his broken Latin, to compete. The Roman soldiers laughed at this hulking barbarian. Severus, amused, decided to humor him. He pitted Maximinus against his toughest legionaries in a wrestling match. One by one, Maximinus threw them to the ground like ragdolls. He defeated 16 of Rome's finest without breaking a sweat. The emperor, stunned and impressed, granted his request. Maximinus was enlisted in the Roman cavalry. This was it. The shepherd boy had just taken his first step on a ladder that would lead straight to the imperial palace. He was no longer just a giant, he was a Roman soldier. Maximinus wasn't just a soldier, he was a force of nature. He rose through the ranks with astonishing speed. His bravery was legendary, his strength a spectacle. Stories of his feats spread like wildfire. They said he could pull a fully loaded wagon by himself, that he could shatter a horse's jaw with a single punch. While other officers learned politics, Maximinus learned war. He served under emperors Caracalla and Elagabalus, but it was under the noble Alexander Severus that his career truly exploded. Alexander, a young and rather bookish emperor, wasn't a military man. He needed a commander who was. He saw the raw talent in Maximinus, and, in a move that would change history, put him in charge of training all the new recruits of the entire Roman army. This was a genius move, but also a fatal one. Maximinus was now the ultimate drill sergeant, molding the next generation of legionaries in his own image, tough, loyal, and ruthless. The soldiers adored him. He was one of them. He spoke their language, the language of the barracks, not the Senate. He fought with them, bled with them, and understood their grievances. They saw in him a true leader, unlike the distant, pampered Alexander, who was dominated by his mother, Julia Mamaea. The army on the Rhine frontier was growing restless. They felt underpaid and disrespected by the government back in Rome. They looked at Alexander negotiating with German tribes, trying to buy peace instead of winning it with steel, and they felt disgusted. They didn't want a diplomat. They wanted a warrior. They wanted Maximinus. The year is 235 AD. The breaking point has arrived. The legions on the Rhine have had enough. In a shocking act of rebellion, they proclaim their commander, the giant Thracian, as their new emperor. They swarm the tent of Alexander Severus and his mother, and in a brutal, merciless act, they murder them both. Just like that, the Severan dynasty was over. Maximinus Thrax, the barbarian peasant who couldn't even speak proper Latin, was now the Emperor of Rome. It was the ultimate underdog story, a testament to the power of the military. The Senate back in Rome was horrified. They saw him as an uncultured beast, an embarrassment to the purple toga. But they were powerless. Maximinus had the one thing that truly mattered: the unwavering loyalty of the legions. As emperor, Maximinus was exactly what you'd expect: a blunt instrument of war. He had zero interest in Rome, in politics, in the Senate. He never even set foot in the capital city during his entire reign. For him, the empire was a battlefield. His court was his camp. His policy was simple: crush Rome's enemies. He immediately launched a massive, brutal campaign across the Rhine into Germania. He wasn't interested in treaties, he was interested in annihilation. He burned villages, slaughtered tribes, and pushed the frontiers of the empire with relentless ferocity. The man was a whirlwind of destructive energy. He was the soldier emperor personified, living and breathing war. His victories were stunning, and his soldiers loved him for it. He was their champion. But this singular focus on war came at a price. A very high price. Wars are expensive, and Maximinus needed money to pay his soldiers and fund his campaigns. So he did what any blunt commander would do. He took it. He doubled taxes. He seized the property of the wealthy senators, the very people who already despised him. He even raided the temples, melting down statues of gods and heroes to mint more coins. This was sacrilege. For the people of Rome and the aristocracy, it was the final straw. He wasn't just a barbarian. He was a tyrant who was bankrupting the empire to satisfy his bloodlust and enrich his army. Resentment boiled over. He was winning battles abroad, but he was losing the war for hearts and minds back home. The crisis exploded in 238 AD, a year now known as the Year of the Six Emperors. It started in Africa, where wealthy landowners, pushed to the brink by Maximinus's tax collectors, rebelled. They proclaimed the elderly governor Gordian and his son as co-emperors. The Senate, smelling blood in the water, eagerly backed the rebellion. They finally had a chance to get rid of the Thracian beast. They declared Maximinus a public enemy. Maximinus, hearing the news from his winter camp, was enraged. He turned his entire army, a seasoned, battle-hardened war machine, and marched on Italy. He was going to crush this rebellion and burn Rome to the ground if he had to. An epic, terrifying showdown was inevitable. The initial rebellion in Africa was quickly crushed, and the two Gordians were killed. But it was too late. The Senate had crossed the Rubicon. Terrified of Maximinus's wrath, they appointed two of their own, Pupienus and Balbinus, as co-emperors to lead the defense of Italy. All of Italy now braced for the impact of the giant's fury. Maximinus and his legions descended from the Alps and laid siege to the city of Aquileia, the gateway to Italy. He expected the city to surrender in fear. He was wrong. The citizens of Aquileia, fired up with hatred for the tyrant, put up a ferocious defense. The siege dragged on. Weeks turned into a month. The unthinkable started to happen. Maximinus's invincible army was being stalled by a city of civilians. Inside the siege camp, morale plummeted. Supplies ran low. Disease began to spread. The soldiers, who once worshipped Maximinus, started to grumble. This wasn't a glorious war against barbarians. This was a miserable, grinding siege against fellow Romans. They were starving. Their families in the provinces were suffering. And for what? To help their emperor settle a personal grudge with the Senate. The loyalty that Maximinus had built his entire life on began to crack. They looked at their giant emperor, pacing his tent in a rage, and they no longer saw a hero. They saw a monster, a tyrant who was leading them all to ruin. The man who lived by the sword was about to die by it. One afternoon, a group of soldiers from the Praetorian Guard had enough. They marched to the emperor's tent. Maximinus, seeing them approach, came out to confront them, his face a mask of fury. But the awe he once inspired was gone. It was replaced by desperation and hatred. Before he could even react, his own men, the very soldiers he had trained and led to victory, fell upon him. They stabbed him again and again. They also murdered his son, whom he had named his successor. The reign of the giant had come to a violent, pathetic end, not on a glorious battlefield, but in the mud of a failed siege, killed by his own troops. They cut off his head, put it on a pole, and sent it to Rome as proof that the beast was finally slain. The story of Maximinus Thrax is a brutal, cautionary tale. It marks a pivotal moment in Roman history known as the crisis of the 3rd century. He was the first of the so-called barracks emperors, men who came from the army, ruled for the army, and were often killed by the army. His rise showed that the throne was no longer the birthright of the aristocracy. It could be seized by any man strong enough to command the loyalty of the legions. But his fall showed the limits of that power. Pure military might, without political skill or public support, was a fragile foundation for an empire.